Hi, it's Alan again, aka Gorilla with a Brush, and today we're going to talk about brushes and brush care. So one of the first things, let's talk about the anatomy of a paintbrush. So this is a Raphael 8404 Kolinsky sable brush. The Kolinsky sable is the type of bristle that you have here, the type of natural hair that forms the tip of your brush. And Kolinsky sable is generally considered the best type of natural hair for miniature painting. It's a very strong hair, it's very durable. If you take care of your brush, it can last a long time. I usually get about 1.5 to 2 years of good solid painting out of my Kolinsky sable brushes. The Raphael is a really popular brand. Winsor & Newton is another popular brand that uses Kolinsky sable. But in general, even if you don't get the Kolinsky sable, you want to get true natural bristles for your miniature brushes. So any kind of sable will be good. The problem with the artificial bristles, so things like nylon or any of those synthetic fabrics or the synthetic bristle types, is that the tips will hook. They're just not as strong, they're not as durable as natural hair. And so over time, and often a very short period of time, you'll get a hook in the end of your bristle. So if you imagine my finger here is the point of the brush, you'll start to get a hooking right at the end. And once your brushes start to hook, it's really difficult to do any kind of detail work with them. And they mostly will just become, your brushes you use for base coating or something. And so they're not going to hold their detail. So again, I recommend natural fiber brushes. Your bristles are tied and tapped down and glued into the end of the ferrule. So there's a little bit of glue right here in the tip where all the bristles are gathered and tied and glued in. And then your ferrule is crimped into usually a wood texture. So a few things that you want to avoid doing with your brushes. You want to avoid leaving them in water for long periods of time. So you don't want to just drop your brush in your water and just leave it sitting there. If you do that, a couple things are going to happen. Your brush bristles are going to get pushed to the side, and they're going to sit there for a long period of time. And if you keep doing that, you're going to deform the tip of your brush, and it's going to be useless for detail work. The other thing that's going to happen is that your wood is going to start absorbing water. And as the wood absorbs water, it spreads out, it gets larger, which pushes against the ferrule. It also pushes against the enamel, the paint coating that you have here on the brush. And then when it dries, it shrinks. If you do that, it's a lot like when water gets down into the cracks in the sidewalk, where it expands, it starts to crack the concrete, then it goes away, water gets in there, it freezes, it expands, cracks the concrete. If you don't take care of your brush, it's going to end up looking something like this. So the tip of this is completely useless for any kind of detail work. All of the coating, the nice, comfortable enamel/paint coating has chipped off. You just get the wood. The tip of it is actually loose. I've had to re-crimp it several times to keep it attached to the wood. And you'll also see that there's a gunky buildup here, right where the ferrule is. So when you're painting, what you would ideally like to do is have your brush absorb the paint up to about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way up. And you want to avoid getting paint all the way up into the ferrule, especially letting the paint dry when it gets up there. So what happens if paint dries in the ferrule is that it starts to create little bits of paint in between each bristle, which will start to push those bristles apart. And as soon as you get enough of that happening, the brush will no longer form a nice sharp tip to it. So if you ever notice any paint getting up into the ferrule of your brush, you want to immediately rinse the brush and wash it out if possible. And the way the brushes are designed, with being tied here and then coming out to the point, is that about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way up, there's a natural pocket that forms in between all the bristles. And the natural hair especially has a wicking feature to it. So when I dip the tip of my brush into any kind of moisture, so water or paint or anything, the bristles want to soak up that water. They want to pull it up the bristle and into this little pocket that's formed here. And that's where you get paint that's held in your brush, and that's why you can continue to move your brush and push paint around your miniature for quite a while, even after whatever's right on the tip has gone away. So as you put pressure on the tip, the paint will flow back down out of that reservoir and onto the miniature. So this is one of the reasons you'll see me a lot of times tap a piece of paper towel, because I want to take away some of the paint that's in that reservoir so that when I touch the model, I can better control the flow of paint out. But then there'll be other times when I want more paint on my paintbrush because I want to use more of it on the model, and I won't empty some of that reservoir. One other thing I want to show you before we actually talk about washing the brush so that you can carry it is you can see right now it looks like this brush is not going to be very useful for detail work. It looks very bushy. It looks like maybe it's seen its better days, so to speak. This is something that happens a lot with natural brushes, even when they're very, very brand new. It's just real hair. It's just like your own hair. And it doesn't always form a tip when it's dry. So one of the things if I wet it, there's a technique called, that probably doesn't have a really fancy name. We just call it twirling or pulling or anything like that. So you pull the brush while you twist it. So as I load the brush and I start to do this pulling and twisting motion, you can actually see that the brush starts to develop a nice tip back on it, and the shape of the brush head looks more like what you would expect a nice brush to have. If you use real paint with this, you'll even get a finer point to it. The water just doesn't have much, doesn't have enough consistency to hold a super fine point. But using this with paint, you would end up getting a fine point to it. So don't worry if you spent $15 on a really nice brush and the second time you use it, it starts to look, something like this. It doesn't mean the brush is low quality. It doesn't mean you got a bad brush. It just means you need to load some paint on it, pull and twist, reform that tip when you're using it. It's something that's very common for natural brushes. So let's talk about washing our brush. There's a lot of different brands of brush soap out there, and they come in different formats. So the type that I use is the Masters Brush Cleaner and Preserver. So this is one that you'll commonly see recommended to painters. There's also Pink Soap, I believe the name of it is, which is a liquid soap and it's pink colored. So washing your brush in the liquid soap is going to be a little bit different, but the same rule applies. You want to be gentle. So if you're using the liquid soap, you want to just slowly, with your fingertips, just work the soap into the bristles, pulling away from the ferrule at all times. And you just slowly work that paint in there, slowly work the soap into it. And that's how you would wash your brush with the liquid soap. The solid soap is takes a little bit more to get started. So right now it's not going to help me wash my brush. It's completely solid, like a bar of soap in your laundry room. So what I like to do is actually get things started with my finger. So just get some water on there and just get it going. Develop some lather. This is another one of those cases where you'll want a separate cup of water from your paint water. Make sure it's nice, clean water. You probably also don't want soap in the water you're adding to your paint later. So just use a different cup of water. And then I'm just going to get the soap on my bristles. And you'll notice that I'm making a brush stroke that pulls the bristles. I'm not jamming the bristles into the soap. You never want to jam the tips of your brush into anything. If you're doing that on a model, you have your base coating and you got to get way back in crevices, don't use one of your best brushes, because that just is a quick way to ruin the tip of your brush and the point. That's part of that brush care, is using the brush the way it's intended to be used, which is to pull the paint. So I'm just going to do this a little bit, make sure all the bristles get coated. And then kind of like with the liquid soap idea, I just gently, I'm not putting much force into this, I'm just gently working the soap in the brush. This is important if you actually have any dried paint on your bristles. This will gently work that dried paint off of the bristles. And depending on how long it's been since you've washed your brush, you might have to do this more or less. Give it a good rinse. And what I like to do is just reform the tip. So taking my paper towel that I have, I just kind of do the roll, the twist and roll technique and reform the tip. Set the brush aside. It's ready to go for your next painting session. Some people will even recommend that you can take a little bit of soap after you've washed it. Reform that tip without rinsing. And then set that aside to dry. And then before you paint for your next session, just rinse that soap off and then start painting. Some people who recommend this will say that this will help to maintain the tip or even restore some of the tip. If it's just starting to get lose a little bit of its sharpness, that's one way you can regain a little of the sharpness. But for the most part, you should be able to just wash your brush every so often, especially when you start to see any kind of dried paint on the bristles. Wash your brush and it'll last a long time. So if you follow all of these brush care tips, it's worth the investment to a $15 or $20 paintbrush because it's going to last you for a year and a half or 2 years of really solid work, great quality paint jobs. Just make sure that you are following some of the tips that I gave you.